sitting room for the Princess Royal Princess Anne. She has opened up the room and opened up her schedule to do something she rarely does, conduct an interview with us about things she doesn't often talk about.
People who were there that night still talk about it. Not because of what was said. Because of what nobody could stop watching. Charles, in his own hall, seeming to fold into his chair. And just a few feet away, his son and daughter-in-law radiating something the king no longer had. Confidence. Colour. Command of the room. Windsor Castle, the 18th of March, 2026. A state banquet. Nigeria's president as guest of honor. St. George's Hall lit up in gold, cameras trained on the top table like always. But something was wrong with the picture. The king looked small. One insider put it simply. William and Kate looked like the future. Charles looked like he was running out of it.
I think he'll change. He is committed to his own level of service, and that will remain.
That's where I want to start today. Not with a scandal. With a picture. Because sometimes the picture tells you more than any headline ever could. For years, the story we've all been told about this family is one of quiet unity. Firm smiles. Coordinated outfits. A monarchy that closes ranks and shows nothing. But peel back just one layer, and what you find isn't unity at all. It's tension. Old tension, freshly exposed by a king's illness and a clock that keeps ticking whether the palace acknowledges it or not. This particular banquet wasn't a small affair, either. It was the first state visit to Britain by a Nigerian leader in almost 4 decades, and the first incoming state visit by a Muslim head of state during Ramadan in nearly a century. The palace made quiet adjustments most people never noticed. A prayer room set up inside the castle. Canapés served before the formal dinner, so guests observing the fast wouldn't go hungry through hours of speeches. A specially designed mocktail, inspired by a classic Nigerian drink, poured for guests who wouldn't be drinking alcohol that night. Small details. The kind of details that usually signal a palace working hard to get a state visit exactly right. And by most accounts, they did get it right. The diplomacy landed. The optics, on paper, were a triumph. Except for one thing nobody could fully manage. The man at the center of the table. Hi viewers, quick question before we go further, and I actually want you to answer this one in the comments. Do you think William will be a stricter king than his father? Yes or no, that's it, drop it below. Because that question matters more than it sounds like it should. This isn't just about a diagnosis anymore.
Well, that's we don't know yet. I mean, there was an order to the years because my mother didn't change very much. We kind of knew what the rhythm of the year was, so things like that will change, and how we are part of the support for the monarchy may change slightly. Who knows?
It's about who's actually running things while the king is still, technically, on the throne. Let's rewind a few months to a wedding that had nothing to do with any of this on paper. Peter Phillips, Princess Anne's son, marrying Harriet Sperling, an NHS nurse, at All Saints Church in the village of Kemble. Small guest list. Reception afterward at Gatcombe Park, Anne's own estate. The kind of family wedding that's supposed to be the easy part of royal life. It was, for both of them, a second marriage. Peter had been married before, to Autumn Kelly, a union that ended after more than a decade. Harriet had her own previous marriage behind her too. By the time they found each other, reportedly at a children's sporting event, bonding quietly over the shared experience of parenting on their own, neither one of them was walking into this with any illusions about how public a Windsor family wedding actually becomes, no matter how hard you try to keep it small. And they did try to keep it small. Kemble is barely a village. A few hundred people, one general store, a train station, 3 pubs. The kind of place where a wedding this size still manages to close roads and rattle the local Facebook group. Harriet wore a gown by Emilia Wickstead, French lace, a clean column silhouette, paired with Jimmy Choo heels and a tiara sourced through Pragnell. Her bouquet, sweet peas and myrtle and lily of the valley, was put together by a florist named Millie Richardson.
Well, I think the slim down was said in a day when there were a few more people around to make that seem like a justifiable comment.
The world changes a bit.
It changes a bit. I mean, it doesn't sound like a good idea from where I'm standing, I have to say.
I'm sure it does
I'm
not.
not quite sure what else we can do.
These are the kinds of details that read like nothing at all until you remember whose family this is, and how much history sits underneath even the smallest choices. Charles was there. Camilla was there. William and Kate were there too. And according to people who attended, something happened that had nothing to do with vows. Insiders say William wanted the couple to have the option of wearing a piece from the royal jewelry collection. A small gesture. The kind of thing that happens at family weddings all the time. Camilla said no. Not quietly, either. Multiple guests reportedly described the tension between William and Camilla that day as sharp enough to notice from across the room. Cordial in public. Ice everywhere else. One line from an insider has stuck with royal watchers since. You could cut the tension between them with a knife. Here's the part that makes this more than gossip. The disagreement wasn't really about a necklace or a tiara. It was about a question this family has apparently been avoiding for a long time. Who gets to decide things? The king? Or the man who will, one day, replace him? William reportedly believes that call should belong to whoever is actually steering the institution. If Charles can't make that decision, he thinks it should fall to the next in line. Not to a queen consort managing her own position. And that's the sentence that should stop you for a second. Managing her own position. Because according to sources close to the family, this wasn't a one-time flare-up. It was the surface of something that had been building for years. One insider described relations between William and Camilla, at that point, as being at an all-time low. An all-time low. Not a bad week.
Not a conversation that I would necessarily have. I think it's perfectly true that it is a moment where you need to have that discussion. But I would just underline that the monarchy provides, with the Constitution, a degree of long-term stability that is actually quite hard to come by any other way.
A low point in a relationship that's been strained since before most of us were paying attention. Guests who were there described the wedding itself as lovely. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody stormed out. That's not how this family operates, and it never has been. What they did instead was quieter, and somehow colder. Two people who kept it very civil, and barely acknowledged each other. No slammed doors. No dramatic exit. Just a kind of royal freudia that everyone in the room could feel, and nobody was allowed to name out loud. There's a detail worth sitting with here too. Charles and Camilla, by most accounts, couldn't stay long. They had somewhere else to be that same afternoon, a planned royal engagement at the Epsom Derby, which meant the king and queen arrived, exchanged the required warmth, and left before the reception had even fully settled into its rhythm. Which means the tension between William and Camilla wasn't stretched out over a long, slow afternoon. It was compressed into a short window. A handful of hours where old grievances had to sit at the same table as champagne toasts and wedding speeches, with nowhere to go and no time to cool off. So how does a family get here? Not overnight. That's the short answer. This didn't start with a wedding, and it didn't start with an illness either. It started almost 20 years earlier with a boy who never asked for a stepmother and never forgave the way he got one. We're going to go back there next. Because you can't understand what happened at that banquet or what's happening behind palace walls right now without understanding what William has been carrying since he was a teenager. And once you see it, the tiara stops looking like the story. It starts looking like the symptom. He was 10 years old when his parents separated. 15 when his mother died. And somewhere in between those two numbers, a name entered his life that he never chose and never fully accepted. Camilla. The affair came out first. Then the divorce. Then, within a handful of years, the single event that changed everything for a boy who was still, by any measure, a child. Diana was gone. And the woman connected to the unraveling of his parents' marriage was still very much here. You don't get over that. Not really. Not even when you grow up, put on a suit, and learn to smile for cameras standing 3 feet away from the person you blame.
It's not really a subject of conversation that I would even go down. A historical perspective, which is slightly different, maybe more realistic.
And which is?
No, the historical perspective, it just goes back a lot further. Mm-hmm. And the modern contexts are very different.
According to Prince Harry's own memoir, both brothers begged their father not to go through with the marriage. He wrote about pumping his father's hand, wishing him well, while privately hoping it wouldn't happen at all. It happened anyway. And by his own account, both sons came to see Camilla less as a stepmother, and more as something closer to a villain in their own story. That's not a metaphor I'm choosing for effect. That's the word that's been used. Royal author Christopher Anderson has spent years tracking this relationship, and his read on it is blunt. William doesn't hate Camilla. He tolerates her. And according to sources close to the family, she spent just as long being a little afraid of him. Sit with that for a second. A woman who became Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, reportedly still careful, still measured, around her own stepson. Here's a quiet pause moment. Not because there's a plot twist. Because I want you to picture the actual dynamic here. Not tabloid warfare. Something colder. 2 people, bound together for life by a title and a bloodline, who never chose each other, and never fully learned to trust one another either. Anderson has described the 2 of them in even starker terms elsewhere. William, he says, can count on Camilla to focus on the king, and on her own grandchildren, and that's about it. Not cruelty. Not warfare. Just distance. A relationship that never became what a family is supposed to be, and settled instead into something more like a working arrangement. It helps to remember what William was actually watching, as a teenager, while all of this unfolded around him. He wasn't just losing a mother. He was watching his father's private life become public property, piece by piece, in a way that felt, to a grieving child, almost obscene. The affair had already been picked apart in newspapers before Diana died. Afterward, every photograph of Charles and Camilla together became its own small referendum on whether the public was ready to forgive. William didn't get to grieve quietly. He got to grieve while the woman connected to his parents, unraveling slowly, carefully, rehabilitated her image in full view of the cameras that had just finished chasing his mother to her death. That sequencing matters. It's not simply that William resented a stepmother. It's that the timeline itself, mother gone, stepmother rising, felt to him like a kind of institutional betrayal, one the family expected him to smile through in public for the rest of his life. That's the emotional inheritance he carried into adulthood, and it's worth remembering it every time you hear a headline about William being cold, or distant, or difficult with Camilla. Cold isn't really the word for it. Vigilant might be closer. A man who watched, up close, what happens when the institution decides forgiveness is more useful than accountability, and who has spent every year since determined not to let that same instinct run unchecked once the crown is his. It's part of why William reportedly found something closer to real family in an unlikely place. His mother-in-law. Sources say Carol Middleton became, in the years after Diana's death, the closest thing to a mother William has had. Someone who showed up for him the way he needed, in a way his own father's household never quite managed. That detail matters here, not as a side note, but as a measuring stick. It tells you exactly how far short Camilla fell of the space she might have filled, and how long that gap has been sitting there, unaddressed. For a while, it seemed like that might soften. Sources say Kate played a real role in that. She never treated Camilla with the coldness William did. She extended warmth Camilla wasn't necessarily used to receiving from that side of the family. And over time, insiders say, that warmth rubbed off. William's guard came down, just slightly. The 2 of them settled into something workable. Not close. Familial, in the loosest sense of the word. But there's a difference between a relationship that's healed, and one that's simply been paused. Because in 2022, something happened that reopened all of it. Queen Elizabeth's health was failing. And with that decline came a piece of constitutional reality nobody in the family could avoid. When Charles became king, Camilla wouldn't just be his wife anymore. She'd be queen consort. A title. A role. A permanent line in the history books. William, according to multiple sources, was not pleased. Not because of tradition. Because of trust. Or more accurately, the lack of it. One insider close to the family put it plainly. Camilla lost his trust a long time ago. And once you lose William's trust, there's no coming back. No coming back. Remember that phrase. Because it's going to come up again, in a very different context, later in this story. For a while, that tension stayed exactly where royal tension usually stays. Beneath the surface. Managed. Contained by good posture and better public relations. Then Charles got sick. And containment stopped being possible. Let's go back to how this actually started, because the timeline matters more than people realize. It was the middle of January 2024 when Buckingham Palace first said anything at all. The announcement then was almost mundane by royal standards. The king would be undergoing a corrective procedure for a benign enlarged prostate, followed by a short period of recuperation. He checked into the London Clinic, a private hospital in Marylebone, on the 26th of January. He was discharged 3 days later. It read, at the time, like the kind of health story that happens to any man in his mid-70s. Common. Manageable. Nothing to build a headline around. Except doctors found something else while they were in there. Something the palace called, carefully, a separate issue of concern. That's the phrase that changed everything. Because on the 5th of February, 2024, Buckingham Palace came back with a second statement, and this one didn't read like a routine health update at all. Subsequent diagnostic tests had identified a form of cancer. Not prostate cancer specifically, the palace was careful to clarify that much, but a cancer nonetheless, serious enough that His Majesty had already commenced a schedule of regular treatments, and serious enough that doctors had advised him to postpone public-facing duties entirely. Think about the discipline behind that wording for a second. Even in crisis, even delivering news that would dominate front pages around the world within hours, the palace chose language engineered to reveal exactly as much as it had to, and not one sentence more. I want you to hold on to that image from the wedding. The tiara. The cold shoulder. The insider who said you could cut the tension with a knife. Because that wasn't the real story. The real story is what happens when an old wound meets a ticking clock. And that clock started ticking on the 5th of February, 2024. That's the day Buckingham Palace made an announcement most of the world wasn't ready for. King Charles III had cancer. Treatment had already begun. For a monarchy built on privacy around anything resembling weakness, this was a rare and deliberate crack in the wall. The palace said the king wanted to be open about it, partly to support the same cancer charities he'd championed for decades as Prince of Wales. But openness about a diagnosis is one thing. Openness about what it means for the line of power is another thing entirely. And that second kind of openness never came. Here's what did happen, quietly, behind the announcement. There's a mechanism in British constitutional law most people have never heard of. Councillors of State. Senior royals, over the age of 21, who can legally act on the monarch's behalf if he's unable to carry out his duties. Normally, there are 4, drawn from the spouse of the monarch plus the next people in line to the throne. Camilla. William. Harry. Andrew. But Harry lives in California now. Andrew has been stripped of his public role entirely, swallowed up by a scandal of his own that's still unfolding. Which meant, on paper, the king's illness had left him with barely any working backup. This isn't new, either. Back in November of 2022, months before Charles was even diagnosed, this exact problem had already been flagged in Parliament. Questions were raised in the House of Lords about the suitability of Andrew and Harry serving as councillors of state at all, given that one had left public life entirely and the other had left the country. Rather than remove them outright, which would have required stripping a legal entitlement in a way that could look like retaliation, the solution that emerged was quieter. Expand the pool instead. Add more working royals to the list, so the two absent names would never actually need to be called upon. So Charles made a formal request, in a message signed by his own hand and read aloud in the House of Lords. Add 2 more names to that list. His sister, Anne. His brother, Edward. Parliament moved fast. A bill was introduced the very next day, and within 3 weeks it had received royal assent, becoming the Councillors of State Act 2022. Buried in that legislation was one more detail that barely made headlines at the time but matters enormously now. The King added a special provision meaning Anne and Edward would remain Councillors of State for the rest of their lives, unlike the others on the list, who will eventually be phased out as George, Charlotte, and Louis come of age. Think about what that means for a moment. The King, more than a year before his own diagnosis, was already quietly restructuring the family's safety net. Already reaching, instinctively, toward the sister who has spent her entire life doing the job nobody applauds. Showing up. Doing the engagements. Going home. And didn't ask for a bigger spotlight. The moment simply handed her one, twice over. First in the quiet legislative maneuvering of 2022. Then again, more urgently, when the diagnosis actually arrived in 2024 and the arrangement she'd been folded into suddenly stopped being theoretical. The initial treatment, by the way, was short. The palace announced in late April of that year that Charles would return to public duties within the week. On paper, that reads like good news. A manageable diagnosis. A brief pause, then business as usual. But here's what nobody outside the palace walls can actually answer. No cancer type has ever been made public. No formal prognosis has ever been released. Which means every single person speculating about this king's timeline, myself included, is doing it without the one piece of information that would actually settle it. That gap, that space where real information should be and isn't, is exactly where all of this tension has been allowed to grow. There was, however, one more update, and it's worth walking through carefully because of how it was worded. In December of 2025, nearly 2 years into treatment, Charles delivered his most detailed health message yet, describing himself as responding exceptionally well and sharing that his doctors had agreed to move his ongoing care into what the palace called a precautionary phase. Not remission. The palace was explicit about that distinction. A precautionary phase, continuously monitored and reviewed, in the king's own words a great personal blessing, but still a phase, still ongoing, still something short of the word everyone actually wanted to hear. And while all of that constitutional maneuvering was happening quietly, in the background, another kind of tension was building in plain sight. William reportedly wanted his father to slow down. To actually take the step back that a cancer diagnosis usually demands from anyone else on Earth. According to one insider, William's frustration wasn't really about medical advice. It was about who kept encouraging Charles to keep going. Camilla. Sources say she pushed him to keep appearing, keep working, keep showing strength, even when his own body was telling a different story. Friends of the king have described his relationship with work in almost existential terms. It has always been his protection, his safe space, one source told a major outlet. Even at his worst moments, it's been an anchor for him. That's not a small detail. That's a man who may not know how to be anything other than king, even while his body is asking him to be something less demanding for a while. And there's evidence for that instinct all over the record. Even through years of treatment, Charles kept hosting state visits. The French president. The American president. The German president. Now the Nigerian one. Each one a public performance of continuity, staged by a man whose own doctors were quietly managing something the public still isn't allowed to fully understand. William, by contrast, has been shaped by a different year entirely. While his father was managing his own diagnosis, Kate was fighting through a cancer battle of her own, and William has since described that stretch as the hardest year of his life. People who've watched him closely say it changed his outlook, made him less patient with performance, and more focused on protecting the people he loves from unnecessary strain. That's the lens he's reportedly bringing to his father's illness now. Slow down. Rest. Let someone else carry the weight for a while. Camilla, by most accounts, has not been offering that same advice. It's worth sitting with what that year actually cost William, because it doesn't get talked about the way the King's diagnosis does. For months, the public knew almost nothing. Kate withdrew from public life entirely, her absence explained only in the vaguest terms, while speculation filled every gap the palace left open. William was, by his own description since, managing two of the most frightening medical situations of his life simultaneously, his wife's and his father's, largely alone, largely in private, while still being expected to show up for public duties with the same composed face the institution has always demanded. People close to him have said that stretch changed something fundamental in how he weighs obligation against family. He came out the other side of it, according to those same sources, with far less patience for anyone who treats appearances as more urgent than actual well-being. Which is precisely the accusation, whether fair or not, that keeps landing on Camilla. One moment crystallized it. The 18th of March, 2026. That state banquet I opened this video with. Nigeria's president as the guest of honor. Windsor Castle lit up like nothing was wrong. According to an insider, the disagreement over whether Charles should even attend that night turned into what they called a huge argument between William and Camilla. William reportedly didn't think his father was well enough to be there. Camilla insisted they both needed to go. They went. And by the end of the night, according to that same source, all anyone in the room could talk about was how unwell the king actually looked. Not the seating plan. Not the speeches. The king's health, on full display, in front of a foreign head of state. One insider used a phrase that should stop you cold. William is past the point of even trying to hide his distaste for Camilla. You can see it written all over his face whenever they're in the same room. Written all over his face. In a family built entirely on the discipline of never showing what you feel in public. Think about how much training goes into that discipline. From the time these children can walk, they're taught how to arrange their features for a camera lens they can't always see. How to nod at a joke that isn't funny. How to stand beside someone they'd rather not be standing beside for exactly as long as protocol demands, and not 1 second longer. It's a skill the family has perfected across generations, arguably the single most consistent trait running through every branch of this bloodline. Which is exactly why a slip like this one, a crack in the mask visible enough for insiders to describe it independently, carries so much more weight than it would in almost any other family. This isn't a man losing his temper. This is a man who has spent 40 years being trained not to, reaching a point where the training itself is starting to fail him. Something had shifted. And for the first time, people close to this family were using a word that had never applied to William and Camilla before. Irreversible. Let's talk about why that word keeps surfacing. Because underneath the arguments about banquets and treatment schedules, there's a much bigger question the palace has never had to answer out loud. What happens to Camilla, specifically, the day William becomes king? Here's what royal protocol actually says. She keeps her title. Likely styled going forward the way the Queen Mother once was, a dowager queen, technically still royal, technically still relevant, but no longer the woman standing beside the reigning monarch. One royal commentator put the shift in blunt terms. Once William takes the throne, every aspect of Camilla's public and private life would be reviewed. Reviewed. Not protected. Not preserved. Reviewed. If you were Camilla, and you'd spent decades working toward a role you reportedly wanted your entire life, how would that sentence sit with you? Because according to insiders, that's exactly the anxiety driving her behavior right now. Sources say Camilla wants Charles to hold onto the reins for as long as he possibly can. Not necessarily out of concern for his health. out of concern for what happens to her position the moment he can't. That reframes everything we just walked through, doesn't it? The pressure to keep working through illness. The insistence on attending a banquet he wasn't well enough for. Suddenly it doesn't look like loyalty. It looks like self-preservation. And she's not only managing tension with William. Reports have also surfaced describing friction between Camilla and Kate. Insiders describe Camilla as territorial by nature, prickly even with people she genuinely supports, and one particular incident, involving Camilla and Kate in the presence of a foreign dignitary, has been described as deeply humiliating for Kate in front of other guests. Sources say Camilla went as far as reminding Kate, in no uncertain terms, that she was still calling the shots, and that it wasn't Kate's place, or William's, to start throwing their weight around. William reportedly noticed the moment, and reportedly hasn't forgotten it either. Two fronts. Two daughters-in-law of a kind. Both reportedly finding out the same thing about Camilla at roughly the same time. There's something almost symmetrical about it, if you step back far enough. Kate spent years being the daughter-in-law who softened the relationship, who extended warmth Camilla wasn't used to receiving, who by most accounts made real progress in thawing a genuinely cold dynamic. And according to these more recent reports, even that goodwill has limits, especially once Camilla feels her own position is the thing actually being negotiated. It suggests the warmth was always somewhat conditional. Fine, so long as nobody's status was actually at stake. The moment William's household started asserting itself, whether over a tiara or over a seating arrangement in front of a foreign dignitary, the older instinct reportedly resurfaced. Protect the position first. Manage the relationship second. She is not going quietly. Not yet. Here's a pause for a moment, because I want to ask you something directly. If you were in Camilla's position, watching your entire future role get reduced to a single word, reviewed, would you be fighting this hard too? I'm not asking you to decide who's right in this story. I'm asking you to sit in the uncertainty with me, because that's exactly where this family currently lives. There's another pressure sitting underneath all of this, one that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as Camilla's position, but should. Prince Andrew. Stripped of his titles. Stripped of his royal duties. Connected for years now to the fallout of his association with a convicted sex offender, and more recently facing legal consequences of his own. The scale of that fall is worth pausing on, because it's almost without precedent. In the autumn of 2025, Buckingham Palace confirmed that Charles had initiated a formal process to remove every remaining style, title, and honour his younger brother held. Not just Duke of York, a title he'd already agreed to stop using under pressure. All of it. Prince. His Royal Highness. Even his birth-given right to the title he'd held since the day he was born as the son of a reigning monarch. Buckingham Palace confirmed that, going forward, he would be known simply as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Historians called it a genuinely rare moment. The last time a prince or princess lost their title in Britain, by most accounts, was back in 1919. It didn't stop with the paperwork, either. Andrew was told to leave Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion near Windsor Castle he'd called home for more than 2 decades, and relocate to a smaller property on the King's Sandringham estate, funded, reportedly, by his own brother. And the fallout kept compounding. Early this year, in February of 2026, he was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office, connected to the same web of allegations that had already cost him everything else. He remains, on paper, 8th in line to the throne, a detail that has reportedly infuriated members of this family and drawn public calls from foreign leaders to have him formally removed. And here's the part almost nobody explains properly. Removing him from the line of succession entirely isn't something the palace or even Parliament can simply decide to do on their own. Because of a decades-old piece of legislation governing the Commonwealth, any change to the succession requires the consent of every single Commonwealth realm, more than a dozen separate governments, all agreeing to amend the rules together. Which means Andrew's name can be stripped from every title, every royal duty, every public appearance, and he can still, technically, sit 8th in line for a throne his own family has gone to extraordinary lengths to keep him away from.